Hello students, welcome to the presentation. Summative assessment. Assessment is a critical part of any second language program. The teacher and the students need to have up-to-date information about the students' abilities, progress and overall development in the language. Summative assessment plays a critical role in this information gathering process. By conducting a variety of forms of summative assessment, the teacher will have a good grasp of where their students are in the learning process. The selection of appropriate assessments should also match course and program objectives necessary for accreditation requirements. In the following modules, we will look at the definition of summative assessment and its objectives, nature, characteristic features and different types of summative assessments. This program will discuss the significant differences between formative and summative assessments. Now let us discuss objectives. To define and present an overview of summative assessment, to discuss the key characteristics and principles of summative assessment, to describe and compare the distinguished key features of formative and summative assessment, to define the various assessment procedures or methods of summative assessments and their aims and purposes in the ESL classroom, and to know the importance of summative assessment in the second language learning. Summative assessment refers to an assessment given at the end of a learning period to determine if learning occurred and often to place some value on how much learning had occurred or to quantify how much a learner knows about the subject matter. Learning may be a secondary benefit as a result of taking a summative assessment, but the primary purpose is to measure learning and to make informed inferences about the learner's ability or level of achievement. Learners are more likely to experience assessment carried out individually, where they are expected to produce discrete language items from memory. This more formal type of testing would probably occur at the end of a semester or academic year, or even at the end of a chapter or a unit. The results then are used to yield a school report and to determine what students know and do not know. This is known as summative assessment. It does not necessarily provide a clear picture of an individual's overall progress or even their full potential, especially if they are hindered by the fear factor of physically sitting for a test, but may provide straightforward and invaluable results for teachers to analyze. For example, it provides information on the teaching and learning and whether the teaching product teaches what it is supposed to teach. In the summative assessment, assessment is carried out for the purpose of summarizing and reporting students' achievement at a particular time, such as the end of a course or program of study. It may or may not have some impact on learning, and the outcome may or may not be used in later decisions about teaching, but such importance is its main rationale. Purpose of summative assessment. Summative assessments, such as exams, are used to evaluate learning as well as serve as comparisons for standards like class averages. They are used to determine what the students know and what they do not know. They can help determine the effectiveness of teaching. Scores can be indicative of the quality of curriculum as well as appropriate placement of students. For example, when students perform well in an English class, they have given the option to select the honors or advanced placement sections of English for the following cycle. However, summative assessments are used incrementally and therefore do not have immediate influence on instructional quality. These assessments are also used to form rankings of schools. If one school's students outperform another school's students on state or regional exams, that school is ranked as a better school for academics. The goal of summative assessment is to evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Summative assessments are often high stakes, which means they have a high point value. According to Atkin and Black 2003, the idea of making a distinction between formative and summative purposes originated in the late 1960s in the context of a curriculum evaluation, where formative evaluation described the effort to improve a program rather than to judge it definitively. The distinction was soon adopted in the context of student assessment as, for example, in the Handbook of Formative and Summative Evaluations of Students' Learning by Bloom et al. 1971, to differentiate between classroom assessment as a part of learning and teaching and assessment as judging learner outcomes. As the terms formative and summative appeared rather formal and academic in communicating with teachers, the alternative phrases and assessment for learning were also used by the assessment reform, among others. In theory, it is possible to distinguish between purposes and uses of assessment, purposes being the reasons for conducting the assessment and uses being what is actually done with the assessment results. A common view of purposes represented by the discussion in Pellegrino et al. 2001 is that there are three main purposes of assessment, namely assessment to assist learning, formative assessment, assessment of individual students' achievement, summative assessment, assessment to evaluate programs. Newton 2007 points out, however, that whilst the first of these is indeed a purpose, the second is not a purpose but a statement of the subject of the assessment, which could have a number of purposes and uses. In the case of formative assessment, there is only one main purpose of the information, which is to help learning. If it is not used for this purpose, then the process cannot be described as a formative assessment or assessment for learning. By contrast, the data from the summative assessment of students' achievement or assessment of learning can be used in several ways, some relating to individual students and some to the aggregated results of groups or population, not all of which are appropriate or valid uses. Key features of formative assessment. The following are the key features: feedback to the students that provides advice on how to improve or move forward and making comparisons with other students. Number 2, students understanding the goals of their work and having a grasp of what is good quality work. 3, students being involved in self-assessment so that they can take a part in identifying what they need to do to improve or move forward. 4, students engaged in expressing and communicating their understandings and skills, initiated by teachers' open and person-centered questions. 5, dialogue between teacher and students that encourages reflection on their learning. 6. Teachers using information about ongoing learning to adjust teaching so that all students have opportunity to learn. Assessment carried out for the purpose of summarizing and reporting students' achievement at a particular time, such as the end of a course or program of study, is described as summative assessment or assessment of learning. It may or may not have some impact on learning, and the outcome may or may not be used in later decisions about teaching, but such impact is not its main rationale. Key features of summative assessment. The following are the key features of summative assessment. Number 1. Relates to achievement of broad goals expressed in general terms rather than the goals of particular learning activities. Number 2. Results reported at certain times, not as an everyday part of learning. 3. Uses evidence obtained when students are involved in special tasks or tests as part of or in addition to regular work. 4. May be based on teachers' judgments, tests, or a combination of these. 5. Involves judging the achievement of all students against the same criteria or may mark scheme. 6. Requires some measures to assure reliability. Typically provides limited, if any, opportunities for student self-assessment. It is important to note that the process of assessment is the same in both cases, and many of the available tools and strategies for carrying out assessment can be used in either context. The adjectives formative and summative describe differences in purpose and not in form. In theory, a distinction can be made between using assessment to help learning and using it to report on what has been learned, but in practice, the distinction is not a sharp one. Nature of summative assessment. The concern is with the assessment of individual students' conceptual understanding, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and action for the purpose of recording and reporting the development at a particular time. This covers a vast range of topics, and in order to keep to manageable proportions, the focus is on the outcomes of primary school students' learning through inquiry. This focus does not mean that basic knowledge of facts, vocabulary and conventions are not assessed, but there are many familiar ways of doing this through classroom tasks, tests and quizzes devised or chosen by the teacher and used at appropriate times. The interactions between assessment, pedagogy and curriculum content. More challenging is to ensure that conceptual understanding, inquiry skills, reasoning and use of evidence together with associated attitudes and actions are assessed. If these attributes are neglected in summative assessment, then on account of the relationships indicated in the above figure 1, it is likely that they will be neglected in the content and pedagogy of the curriculum experienced by students. Marthone and Ciresi 2009 discuss the importance of alignment among these aspects of the curriculum and describe methods for evaluating the alignment between state standards and assessment. Characteristics of quality summative assessments. Today, the term summative assessment conjures up images of standardized tests, benchmarks, data collection and exams. In many ways, these have been overemphasized to point that we have missed the true value of summative assessments. We need to look no further than many of our own tests, which overemphasized multiple choice questions in an attempt to mimic our state's tests, as an example of what summative assessment should not be. We must move away from summative assessments being synonymous with districts, state and national tests. Summative assessments should play an integral part in our educational system. And how about what summative assessments should be? These 7 characteristics comprise a quality summative assessment. Quality summative assessments should be predefined by a group of teachers and involve the students. So as to tempting and time saving as it is, we shouldn't sue pre-crafted rubrics or textbook created tests. Assessments must provide students with opportunities to demonstrate what they know. Challenge students to transfer what they have learned to specific and real life tasks. All assessments should correspond with important learning targets and essential questions, so they yield true information about student progress. Summative assessments must provide meaningful feedback to both the student and the teacher. By doing so, assessments help increase student motivation to learn. Non-judgmental feedback motivates students for further effort, while using grades as rewards or punishments decreases student motivation. Incorporate 21st century skills and content into assessments. Summative assessments should not be limited to high-stake tests. The purpose of any summative assessment is to provide meaningful reports on students' achievement, and effective summative assessments help students achieve to their highest abilities. Using summative assessments to both evaluate students as well as curriculum planning. With regard to summative assessment, information about students' performance at a particular time can be obtained by tests or special tasks given under controlled conditions or embedded in classroom activities. Building a record over time, as in a portfolio created by teachers or their students. Summarizing information gathered by teachers during their work with the students over a period of time. Summative assessment takes place after the learning has been completed and provides information and feedback that sums up teaching and learning process. Typically, no more formal learning is taking place at this stage, other than incidental learning, which might take place through completion of projects and assignments. Summative assessment or assessment of learning can take many forms. Here are some possible types of summative assessment that can be used in the language classroom. Number 1. Performance task. Students are asked to complete a task that will test a specific set of skills and abilities and determine what the students know and are capable of doing. A rubric, a checklist, or other form of scoring guide should accompany this type of assessment. Let's look at number 2. Written product. Students are asked to write an original selection. There are many written forms that teachers can use to get students right. In addition, students may be asked to write about a previous activity such as a field trip or guest speaker. Students may also be asked to create a piece of pervasive writing or a reflection about their own language learning experience. A rubric, checklist, or other form of scoring guide should accompany this type of assessment. Now let us look at the third one, oral product. Students are asked to prepare an oral piece of work. This can take the shape of any forms of the oral tasks. A rubric, checklist, or other form of scoring guide should accompany this type of assessment too. Number 4, test. The students are asked to write a test at the end of a section, chapter, unit, theme, etc. to demonstrate what they know. Now let us look at the fifth one, standardized test. Students are asked to write a task that is standardized in terms of content of the test and conditions under which the test is written. There are provincial standardized tests administered at many grade levels such as TOEFL, GRE, IELTS, etc. The following are also considered as some forms of summative assessments: term papers, drafts submitted through the semester would be a formative assessment. Projects, project phases submitted at various completion points could be formative assessment. Portfolios could also be assessed during its development as a formative assessment. Performances, student evaluation of the course, and instructor self-evaluation. These are considered as some forms of summative assessments. Procedures used in summative assessment. Summative assessment employs a variety of tools and methods for obtaining information about what has been learned. In this way, summative assessment provides information at the student, classroom, and school levels. Examples of summative assessment include the following. For example, end of unit tests or projects. When assessments reflect the stated learning objectives, a well-designed end of unit test provides teachers with information about individual students, identifying any student who failed to meet objectives, as well as provides an overall indication of classroom instruction. Next one is course grades. If end of a course grades are based on specific criteria, course grades provide information on how well a student has met the overall expectations for a particular course. Next one is standardized assessments. Tests that accurately reflect state performance and content standards provide an indication of how many students are achieving to established grade level expectations. Next one is portfolios. When used as part of an evaluation of student learning, portfolios provide evidence to support attainment of stated learning objectives. In this manner, when summative and formative assessments are aligned, they can inform the instructional process and support both the daily instructional practices of teachers as well as longer term planning of curricula and instruction. How summative outcomes inform instruction and educational practices. Assessment entails a collection of procedures that inform the learning process. Summative assessment informs instructional practices in a different yet equally important way as formative assessment. Critics of large-scale assessments argue that they adversely affect the classroom and remain disconnected from the instruction, to the extent that they are not useful in the instructional process. However, summative assessment can serve both as a guide to teaching methods and to improving curriculum to better match the interests and needs of the students. A primary use of assessment data is in planning curricula. For example, if a school's performance on a state assessment indicates high percentages of students who do not meet standards in writing, then the school could collect more information on its writing, curricula, student writing performance through portfolios or other classroom work and professional development needs for its teachers. After collecting such information, the school may then review and adopt new writing curricula as well as provide professional development to its teachers in order to support stronger student achievement in writing. Ongoing evaluation of the writing program would be conducted through the use of formative and summative assessment. In this manner, when summative and formative assessments are aligned, they can perform the instructional process and support both the daily instructional practices of teachers as well as the long-term planning of curricula and instruction. So, it is important to note that assessment entails a collection of procedures which inform the learning process. So, summative assessment informs the instructional practices in a different yet equally important way as a formative assessment. Through this program, so far we have discussed the objectives of the program, and some of them let us summarize as the following. It was discussed that need to define and present an overview of the summative assessment. We have also discussed the key characteristics and principles of summative assessment. We have also discussed and compared the distinguished key features of the formative and summative assessment. And the objective also was to define the various assessment procedures or methods of summative assessments and their aims and purposes in the ESL classroom. And also we have the objective to know the importance of summative assessment in the second language classroom learning. The assessment, as we have already discussed, is a crucial part of any second language program. The teacher and the students need to have up-to-date information about the students' abilities, progress and overall development in the language. As we have seen, summative assessment plays a critical role in this information gathering process. By conducting a variety of forms of summative assessment, as known as assessment of learning, the teacher will have a good grasp of where the students are in their language learning process. Therefore, the selection of appropriate assessment should also match the course and program objectives necessary for the accreditation requirements. So, in all these modules, we have looked at the definition of summative assessment and some of the objectives of summative assessment, the nature, the characteristic features and different types of summative assessment. So, through this program, we also discussed the significant differences between formative assessment and summative assessment. We have also discussed certain key features of both formative assessment and summative assessment, and we have also discussed some of the examples of both formative assessment and summative assessment. So, this is the end of presentation.